Hey there, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and I have another lesson in air power for all of you, and that is trains are targets. Yes, indeed, us as aviation geeks and military air power aficionados, we do not like trains for two reasons. First of all, trains are incredibly efficient at moving men and material from A to B, and much more so than aircraft, and we can't have that. And the second reason, of course, follows from that first reason, is that if you want to erode an adversary's ability to move men and material really well from the hinterland to the front lines or amongst the different front lines that the enemy is fighting at, you need to cut rail lines and trains and that ability to move all these things. And if we look at World War II, and this is really the study that we're going to do today in today's video, we're going to look at the Luftwaffe interdiction effort against Polish rail transportation in 1939 as a case study of how the Luftwaffe first of all learned how to do interdiction and what this means overall. But it is not just limited to, of course, 1939 in Poland. We see the same thing in France happening, and we also see the same thing in the Soviet Union then, first of all with the Germans trying to destroy Soviet transportation, rail transportation, and also on the Soviet side they use partisans against German rail movements in the Balkans and of course in what is now Eastern Europe. And of course then, if we go beyond that as well, the Western Allies are very well versed in this as well. With 1944 and 1945, that drive into Germany is also inherently linked to cutting German rail transportation. But sticking to Poland in this regard here, why is rail so good at moving men and material? Well, a standard wagon or standard rail carriage of the time can transport anywhere between 6 to 15 to 24 tons, and there's even carriages that have been built for more weight. You will have seen pictures of tanks being transported on rail and so on and so forth. Whereas an aircraft, typically most transportation aircraft, let's look at the German Ju-52 or even the American C-47, transport between 1 to 2 tons of cargo. And of course, a rail carriage has also a lot more volumetric advantages over an aircraft where the tight space, you can't actually fit that much inside. And if you work in logistics or have any sort of experience with that, you know exactly what I refer to when I refer to the importance of the volume rather than just the pure weight of what you can transport. So rail is incredibly good at doing that, whereas aircraft, yes, they're faster and they can be perhaps more targeted because you can, provided you have a field to land in or to drop things into, you can get closer to where you want to be. With rail networks, you are a bit more reliant, well, you are inherently reliant on the network that has been built and also the network that comes out of that with road transportation, but still you get so much more tonnage that can be transported with it. So trains are targets then, yeah? Audience participation question that is going out to all of you now. You can write your pre-answer to this as we go through this video in the comments already and then edit it later on if something new popped up. The participation question is, do you think that you should destroy the trains, or do you think that you should destroy the rail stations, so the hubs of where this transportation comes out and into? Well, trains, you can say, well, if we destroy the train and we stop them from running, that works because then you can't really use the network that you have. But perhaps hitting the stations is more rewarding because they're a fixed target, they can't move, and you're not as reliant on up-to-date information, reconnaissance information on where the trains actually are, because the station, well, it's always going to be there. And it's a larger target, so if bombers come in and they can drop bombs and they can just saturate the area and obliterate the rail station, that should work in the advantages of bombers. This is of course the age-old question that air power has. Do you hit the equipment or do you hit the infrastructure that is in place to use the equipment? We can even draw parallels here to the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe, does it hit the airfields? Does it take the fight to the fighter squadrons of the RAF? Or does it hit the infrastructure, the industry that supplies the RAF? It's a worthwhile discussion to have in the terms of air power. So now let's go into Poland with all that introduction done. I'm going to pull here from the experience reports from the Luftwaffe, specifically Luftwaffe 1. So this is the one that is attacking or basically attached or supporting the thrust of Army Group Nord. I said that in a German American way, Army Group North, or Armeegruppe Nord for the Deutsch. You know what I mean. And specifically here, I'm looking at some of the Geschwaders, Kampfgeschwaders, as well as the Fliegerdivision 1, which is sort of a subunit of Luftflotte 1, and within Fliegerdivision 1 there are the Geschwaders, and also Luftkommando Ostpreußen, which was in that German enclave that was cut after the First World War by the Polish corridor, or the so-called Polish corridor. Now, Fliegerdivision 1, when it comes to hitting the train stations here first, let's talk about those hubs. Says that opinions on success are very contradictory because as you attack the station, it actually turns out that you can resume operation from the stations even with concentrated bombardments very quickly. And Luftkommando Ostpreußen basically agrees, saying it's not just the destruction that is difficult to sustain, but it's that there are too many alternative routes. So in an area like Central Europe, Poland, the rail network was really rather well developed. You had lots of different lines. So if you destroy one station, sure enough, that's going to cause some complications. But if there's another station somewhere in the area that you can alternate to, then there isn't really that much of an impact. And also they highlight that a lot of these large hubs are defended with fighter squadrons and specifically AA as well, which push you up to altitude, at which point you're no longer going to be so accurate. What's also really interesting is that Luftwaffe Kommando Ostpreußen says the following, open quote, "Railroad stations are only worthwhile targets if they are consistently used and the primary objective is to destroy the cargo," end quote. And Luftflotte 1 then, crystallizing all these learnings from the different Geschwaders and the Fliegerdivision and Luftkommando Ostpreußen, basically says that high altitude attacks, they only promise success if there are a lot of trains at the station, which now pushes us towards, well, if it's difficult to destroy these stations outright, and if these stations can be very quickly repaired, or as they're being repaired, cargo can be rerouted to different stations in the area, then attacks against stations are really not advisable unless you have a lot of cargo there. And what you really should be going for are the trains. And that's what the Germans then also started doing. They started, instead of attacking the hubs, they started to attack the trains. So if your answer previously was, I don't want to hit the stations, I want to hit the trains, then you might now at this point be like, oh yeah, I got it right. However, yeah, there is that twist. Once you're outside the station, trains are incredibly difficult to hit. Think about this first. What do you have to do in order to attack a train? It's not just sending out planes with bombs or machine guns or cannons to hit the train. First of all, you need to know where is that train. So you need to have up-to-date reconnaissance data in order to see, so at this station, trains have come in yesterday, and then this morning, some of these trains have gone. So they're most likely going to be routing trains this way. So you take pictures of different stations, of different routes, and you start piecing together where are these trains at any given point in time. And you don't do this just in one day, you do this across many days in order to build up sort of an awareness, not just what capacity there is on rail, but also how is the adversary distributing this, which routes are being used, what are their focal points, where are they drawing forces from, where are they pushing forces or stockpiles towards. So you need to do that. And in an age where we didn't have satellites and up-to-date reconnaissance data that comes in just like this, you're always working with a delay of a couple of hours. So reconnaissance data are incredibly important, and as you're building that up, maybe you're starting to identify certain areas where you can pinpoint more or less the times when trains are going to be departing. But now we're going to talk about what do you use that information for? Well, you're sending out bombers now. Turns out that it is incredibly difficult to do so. Because, first of all, you need to have bombers on standby for this duty. And the Luftwaffe is in an all-out assault against Poland. And it starts bombing cities, it starts bombing stockpiles, it starts bombing airfields, it starts bombing troop concentrations and so on. So there's all these different missions that they have to do. So you're not always going to have standby bombers. This is actually something that the Germans developed in 1942, 1943 on the Eastern Front, where they have specific Staffeln or Gruppen that are used only to hunt railway transportation and specifically trains. in support of specific operations. So it's also a very temporal operation that is limited in both time and space to supporting the operations of the Heer by eroding that Soviet ability to bring in reinforcements. But they don't have this just yet. So from the time you're getting the information from your reconnaissance squadrons, which may take somewhere between 3 to 6 hours, it's not as quick as is sometimes made out during the Battle of Poland. Really, this sort of information transfer takes time, unless we're talking about very dedicated squadrons which are not part of this anti-rail interdiction effort. And then you have, in that moment when the information comes in, you have to prepare the Gruppe or the whole Geschwader in order to attack the trains that are going on. So you're reserving anywhere between, let's say, 9 to 18 aircraft in order to attack rail, which, if you calculate how much bombs you could put on other targets, suddenly there's a discussion there, should you really be doing this or not? But let's say you do that. Let's say you're going out and you're going to hit those trains. At high altitude, and this is something that they basically discover really quickly, it's incredibly hard to hit something that is as thin and elongated as a railway track. Because this is not the US, where you have railway tracks that are just running straight for miles and miles and miles. This is Europe, where you have some areas that are like that, but there's small curvatures as well, winding areas in the rail network that are a lot more difficult to hit. And as you're setting out an attack at high altitude, you have to start planning 15 minutes in advance, and then you sort of hand over to your bombardier or bomb emir, if you're British, to say, okay, I'm handing over control of the aircraft to you now. And they're starting to make their computations about hitting the railway line. They have to find it and so on and so forth. And in order to hit a train, not only do they have to hit the railway track, but they also somehow have to have the ability to spot the train, at a completely different point that is maybe hidden somewhere from their perspective, as they're also looking down the bomb site, and they're starting to think, okay, so the train is over there and I have to hit it when it goes there, and they're doing this computing. It's basically impossible. And that's what the Germans realize. High altitude against rail transportation and against rail tracks, impossible. Not going to be really working. Are you going to hit it every now and then? Yes. But considering how many resources you have to field in order to achieve 1 or 2 hits, really not worth it. So they're saying, okay, we have to do this from medium to low altitude, and really from low altitude. Even medium altitude doesn't work that well. But what they're discovering here is that if you drop it from low altitude, and by the way, for the Luftwaffe at this point in time, low altitude attacks are somewhere between 70 to 200 meters, doctrinally speaking. You have to worry about AA fire, specifically around stations and bridges, and for some Polish trains as well. Not all the Polish trains. The Poles, of course, have those famous combat trains or armored trains, but not all of them. But some trains, some cargo trains may have a machine gun on, or something like a low caliber AA gun. So you have to worry about that a bit. And as you're going to go really straight and level towards the target, the AA gunner will have a relatively easy time of actually tracking at least 1 or 2 bombers as they're coming in and firing at those. But as you're then dropping the bombs, and this is really the main issues, the Lehrdivision tells us from Luftwaffe 1, but it was integrated in Luftwaffe Kommando Ostpreußen, tells us, quote, low-flying attacks on open stretches of track and bridges were generally unsuccessful, as the bombs rolled off the embankment or bridge due to the delayed fuses. When you're coming in low, you're using a delayed fuse, which, by the way, sometimes in video games you can set exact the amount of seconds. In reality, that's not like this. You have preset fuses for like 0.1 second to 10, 11 seconds, or even longer than that. But because you don't have an anti-ricochet plate at this point in time attached to the bomb's frontal part, as you're dropping it from very low altitude, it bounces off, right? And you may say, well, why use a delay fuse? Well, if you're dropping something between a 250 to 500 kilogram bomb on a railway track and your formation of planes coming in, there's some serious considerations there regarding friendly fire. So you're going to have to use a relatively long delay. And as that happens, bombs glance off and roll off the embankment of the rail, and then they just poof out somewhere along along the embankment. So that's not going to happen. And the Stachelbombe, which some of you may know from the Eastern Front in the early 1940s, that doesn't exist yet. So this was an innovation that actually the Germans had at this point in time. They fixed this spike on the front of the bomb, so as it comes even at a shallow angle, it hits the ground and it buries itself in the ground and then it explodes. And that was specifically done for railway tracks, which are different to the Nordsterbe, by the way, which are fuse extenders, which were used in mountainous terrains. That's something different. So what you have is, if you want to hit the trains or even the railway tracks, with bombers, you have operational, tactical, and technical issues at doing this. So what are you left with? Well, one solution you could say is like, hang on, the Germans, they didn't just have bombers, not just the Dornier 17s, not just the Heinkel 111s. They have Stukas, they have Bf-110s. Can't they do something about this? I will touch upon that towards the end of the video. We're staying with the bombers because the bomber force, remember, the bomber force of the Luftwaffe is the main striking arm in doctrine as well as in operational terms during the Battle of Poland and all the way until arguably 1942, 1943 in operational terms and in industrial terms until 1944, mid-1944. So we are left with problems at destroying not just the station, but also the trains. So what do you do? Well, the Luftwaffe has looked at all of this and said, what we really need to do is destroy the network. No, don't just focus on the trains, don't just focus on the stations. Those are elements, and they're cogwheels in this machine. But really what we want to destroy is the whole railway machine. And Luftwaffenkommando Ostpreußen here tells us then, open quote, to interrupt the railway line and make repair work more difficult, it is more effective to hit it as often as possible and at difficult to reach points, end quote. So those are specifically areas that are also difficult to access to if you want to repair the railway line. So we are back to hitting the overall infrastructure, but not just specific points, but hitting it comprehensively across many areas. Now, by the way, one question here to you as audience, as the viewer. Do you want me, these German sources, do you want me to read them out first in German and then translate the learnings, or do you want me to translate them to English straight up? Question to you, because I've seen preferences in the comments for me either way. And also a big thank you here, of course, to all the channel supporters who actually help me fund my research trips to archives and so on and so forth. And of course, you as channel supporters get early access to all these videos as well in batches of 3 to 4 videos. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, look in the description below and support the channel. Anyway, going back, how do you attack a railway line comprehensively? Well, there's 2 ways of looking at this. First, let's go into the tactical level. How are the Luftwaffe actually using the bombers to do this, to destroy a railway line? Well, they're not going to send out the full Geschwader in a formation flight. So think about sort of the combat boxes we see from the defense of the Reich later on with the Allied combined bomber offensive coming in with this massive swarm of bombers in these tight formations, dropping bombs to really saturate a specific target on the ground. The Luftwaffe looks at this and says like, well, if we do that with bombers in 1939, it's not going to work because it's too inflexible. And a lot of these bombs that you're going to drop are not going to go anywhere near the railway lines or anywhere near the station even. So what they develop is, in order to go after the railway tracks, they break up their Gruppe into the individual Staffeln and then use Ketten. So basically a Kette is usually quoted as 3 aircraft, sometimes it goes up as far much as 5 aircraft, but it uses a Kette to attack railway lines because that's the best sort of optimal formation that has the flexibility and maneuverability while also having accuracy and a little bit of mutual protection and saturation on the target, which is good. And the way they want to attack the railway lines is almost in parallel, but what you're going for is, as you're seeing the railway line, you're going at a sort of a 10 degree to 30 degree angle. You want to hit it from there, because if you hit it straight up, just being a little bit offset is going to release the bombs too far out from the actual railway line. And if you're coming in perpendicular, it's very likely that the bombs are going to land on either side of the railway track. So what you're going to do is you're going to come in at an angle, and then you have the highest chance of maybe getting 1 or 2 hits on the railway line. So that's one of those tactical learnings that they had. And Kampfgeschwader 1 here tells us, open quote, against railways, parallel flight on railways, with the caveat that it's actually 10 to 30 degrees, one aircraft behind the other from attack altitudes between 800 to 1,500 meters. Exact partitioning of the track down to the individual kette, ensuring interruptions at as many points on the open track, end quote. And this is it. This is what they're doing. So they're going to raise the altitude just slightly away from that sort of 70 to 200 meters like general low altitude attack where the bomb is bounds off. They're going to 800 to 1,500 meters where the bomb has a reasonable chance of not bouncing off, as well as you don't necessarily have to use a delay fuse because you're high enough to not risk friendly fire. And you're going to have one aircraft behind the other in a kette, so let's say 3 to 5 aircraft, going in a parallel flight to the railways. Well, again, some of the learnings I've seen is actually that what they were supposed to do is 10 to 30 degrees. That is really what you were supposed to do. But then the really important element of this this section here from Kampfgeschwader 1 is that you're using the Ketten not just on one target, but you're partitioning it across the whole line. So you're creating more gaps that need to be fixed up by the adversary, by the Poles in this case. And that's really important because the Luftwaffe realizes that you can repair railway lines very quickly. They say Poland is able to repair lines, so that is a stretch of track, within 24 hours. So every 24 hours, preferably every 12 hours actually, you'd have to sustain the attacks on specific areas to keep it comprehensively delinked from A to B, right? And the same thing goes for railway stations, in fact. The Luftwaffe says that within 12 hours, the Poles have always repaired their railway stations to the point where they can reuse at least some of the tracks in order to send material and men from A to B. And this is really interesting. Kampfgeschwader 1 here again, open quote, it is recommended that certain areas be assigned to the squadron to combat the railways so that the railway lines in them can be attacked systematically according to their traffic and in connection with the targets of the other squadrons, end quote. So that is more of a big picture look at it. Yes, you want to have certain areas that are assigned almost like combat boxes. You may be familiar from the Gulf War, right, where the Americans had partitioned Iraq into certain combat boxes where planes were flying around, and if they spotted something, they would attack it. Similar to that. However, it is not necessarily that these aircraft are going to fly around the whole time, but you are attacking as you are pinpointing certain areas or as you're pinpointing a need to do it systematically according to the need of both the German armed forces as well as what you're seeing on the railway lines, what the Poles were doing, and of course in connection to other targets from other squadrons. So you're having this big picture lens of saying, this is the air war currently, how do we fit into that? Really, really important so that the effect that you're delivering on target just doesn't fizzle out and it's just not worthless on the strategic level. And Luftwaffe 1 really says the most important thing is that you either permanently destroy it at one point, the railway infrastructure, or you cause as many disruption as possible along the entire route. And this is the learning for air power from today's video. And you see this across air power operations from the First World War over to quite arguably right now, where the biggest challenge and learning for air power is how do you destroy targets comprehensively and how do you keep them destroyed and how does that fit in to delivering a strategic effect on the battlefield so that you're not just doing something, destroying something, but the overall war effort on your side benefits from that. And of course, during the interwar years, as you're leading up to the Second World War, most countries completely overestimate the effect of bombing and they completely underestimate the defensive capabilities of a country as well as the repair capabilities of a country. And that causes this sort of initial learning that every single country has to go through of hitting targets and then thinking they're destroyed and then very quickly realizing actually that's not the case. Look at the Allied bomber offensive. The Americans and the RAF, they were looking for that key link in the German industry that would make the whole thing collapse. The golden ticket, the silver bullet, that didn't exist. And we can have a discussion about oil. the modern historiography has looked at that and has more or less myth busted this thing of like that going after the German oil reserves ended the war. That's very much something that the United States Army Air Force and then later Air Force said, because obviously it's a way of saying we won the war, right? It's that inter-service rivalry that's happening there as well. It certainly was important, but it wasn't a knockout blow to the Germans. Luftwaffe, or rather air power, works on compounding on different attacks and helping the overall war effort. And really, we have to think about this from a sustainment perspective as well to make it, to really crystallize the learning here. Because if you're just attacking certain areas, certain pieces of infrastructure, how is that going to fit in for the whole war, right? Because you're binding a lot of forces, and you're also, as you're carrying out these attacks, make them very predictable. Look at the Battle of Britain. Germany just sends out wave after wave of bombers against RAF airfields, and yes, the RAF takes a pounding. But what's the strategic effect that's actually being caused there? The RAF decreasing combat number, okay, fair enough. Germany still has to send troops across the channel in order to compound, or in order to use that advantage that they have now gained in getting air superiority across Britain, right? And if you don't do that, what's basically going to happen is mutual attrition. You have air forces that attack targets, destroy those targets, and then you have the other side that starts countering that and repairing these targets, and you're going seesaw. And what happens? And look, and as we look at the Battle of Poland, the Luftwaffe uses up by the end of the war, by the end of that operation, they have used up 50% of their armor stocks. Within roughly 4 weeks, the Luftwaffe has expended 50% of their ammo on Poland. Now imagine if that conflict would have taken longer. Imagine where ammunition supply would have been for the Luftwaffe. It was down to throttling operations at given times because they couldn't restock their ammunition supplies. And German logistics, by the way, better than most people say, but yes, there are some issues there. But really, it's the production capacity of being able to produce all this ammunition that was problematic. And the only reason why the German Luftwaffe was so successful in many ways is because it was tied into the overall war effort of having this ground offensive that took advantage of the air attacks, and that's where you create that strategic effect. So this is very interesting in my case. Now, I did say, as we're coming to the end of this video, I want to say something about the Stuka and the Bf-110. Yes, we're going to do that actually in a future video, but quick answers here, because I assume that some of you want to know already, sort of a teaser here. The Bf-110 was used against trains and on ground attack as well, and basically the learning was it wasn't built for this. It's too vulnerable. Let's not do that. And with the Stuka, you actually have a specialized capability, and that potentially offsets the advantage or the disadvantage of the bomber, and that is accuracy. And how that works, we will explore in a future video. As always, big thank you to patrons and channel supporters for making this channel possible. If you have any questions, feedback, or comments to this video, put them down below, and I'll see you on the next one. Have a great day, and see you in the sky.